The Artemis II crew came home on April 10, 2026, and immediately stopped talking. Not entirely, not in any way you could prove. But if you watch the post-mission press conferences carefully, if you pay attention to which questions Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen answer fully, and which ones get redirected to, "We're still processing the data," a pattern emerges.
I have not processed what we just did, and I'm afraid to start even trying.
There are things the four astronauts saw during their 10 days in deep space that they have not described in detail. Photographs that were taken but have not been released. Observations that were radioed to Houston during the lunar flyby and were quickly moved off the public communications loop. Officially, none of this is suppression. It's standard mission analysis. Data takes time to process. Imagery has to be calibrated. Verbal observations have to be cross-referenced. That's the official line, and it's not a lie. It's also not the whole truth. Because Apollo astronauts came home from the moon with stories they couldn't tell either, and some of those stories took 40 years to leak out of the archive. Artemis II just did something no human mission has done in 53 years, and the silence that has settled over parts of what they saw is the loudest thing about the mission. Start with what we know, because that establishes the floor. The four astronauts launched on April 1st aboard the Orion capsule they had named Integrity. They flew a free return trajectory around the far side of the moon. On April 6th, at their closest approach, they came within 4,667 miles of the lunar surface. They reached a maximum distance from Earth of 252,756 miles, breaking the record Apollo 13 had held since 1970. They captured roughly 10,000 photographs across a 7-hour observation window. They watched a solar eclipse from a vantage point no human eyes had ever occupied, with totality lasting nearly 54 minutes. They saw at least 6 meteoroid impact flashes on the darkened lunar surface, and during the closest part of the flyby, when the moon itself blocked all signals between them and Earth, they spent roughly 40 minutes in complete radio blackout. No telemetry, no voice, no way for anyone on the ground to know what they were doing or saying. That window is where the questions begin. Here is what NASA released in the first weeks. Beautiful images of Earth setting behind the lunar horizon, wide shots of the cratered far side, the eclipse photographs showing the corona blooming around the dark lunar disk, verbal descriptions from the crew about color variations on the surface, about the rugged topography, about the impact flashes that made scientists in Houston scream. All of it carefully framed, scientifically valuable, perfectly publishable. What NASA didn't release in those first weeks was the rest. There were 10,000 photographs taken. The number released to the public in the immediate aftermath was a few dozen. The verbal observations from the radio blackout window have not been transcribed for public release. The personal radiation dosimeters each crew member wore have produced data that NASA has not detailed. The Avatar bone marrow chips, miniature human tissue samples grown from the crew's own cells and flown alongside them, are still being analyzed at Harvard's Weiss Institute, and the early results have not been made public. None of this is necessarily sinister. Most of it is bureaucratic. Science is slow. But there is a specific category of observation from the mission that the crew has been notably careful around, and it has to do with what they heard. Apollo 10, May 1969, 3 astronauts, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan, passed behind the far side of the moon. During the radio blackout, when no signal could reach Earth, a sound began bleeding through their headsets, a whistling, oscillating tone. One of them said on the recording, "It sounds like outer space-type music." Another said, "Shall we tell them about it?" The third answered, "No one will believe us." They did not tell anyone. The transcripts were declassified in 1973. The audio reached the public in 2016. The official explanation eventually was radio interference between the lunar module and the command module, 2 transmitters on similar frequencies producing a beat pattern that sounded like a whistle. It is almost certainly correct. Almost. Apollo 11's Michael Collins heard the same sound, and wrote in his memoir that had he not been warned about it ahead of time, it would have scared him badly. Apollo 8, which carried no second radio, heard nothing. The pattern is clean, the hardware explanation fits, but it took NASA decades to release any of it, and the crews who heard it spent most of their lives refusing to discuss it on the record. Artemis II flew the same path. Different hardware, different communications architecture, different decade, but the same 40-minute window of total isolation behind the moon. And in that window, 4 people saw and heard things that have not been fully described in any public press conference. Reed Wiseman has talked about the experience of seeing Earth disappear behind the lunar horizon as bending the mind. Jeremy Hansen has described the three-dimensionality of the lunar surface as something that no photograph had prepared him for. Victor Glover has compared the solar streamers radiating from the corona during the eclipse to the spotlight on top of the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, then immediately taken it back, saying the comparison didn't do it justice. Christina Koch, the most experienced of the 4, has been the quietest. She spent 328 consecutive days on the International Space Station before this mission. She has flown longer in space than any other woman in history, and in the post-mission interviews, when reporters asked her what surprised her most about deep space, she has answered carefully, "I'm still processing it." That is the phrase. Watch the press conferences and count how many times it shows up. Still processing. We'll have more to share when the analysis is complete. There were things we observed that we want to make sure we describe accurately. It is the language of an astronaut corps that has learned over 6 decades to be extremely careful about what gets said into a microphone. Because here is the rule that has governed NASA's relationship with anomalous observations since 1969. An astronaut who reports something they cannot explain risks being grounded. The standing policy in the Apollo era was that any sign of psychological strain, hallucination, or unexplained perception could end a flight career permanently. Apollo 9's Rusty Schweickart admitted to severe motion sickness in orbit and never flew in space again. The lesson was learned across the Corps, and it was learned quickly. If you see something strange, you do not say so on an open channel. You file it later, you discuss it carefully, and sometimes you carry it to your grave. The official line is that this policy has been retired. Anomalous observations are now considered scientific data, not disqualifying events. NASA has said this on the record. The question is whether that policy holds when a specific astronaut with a specific career has to actually make the call. The Artemis II crew has flown 1 mission. There are at least 3 more Artemis missions scheduled before 2030. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen are all candidates for future flights, including the lunar surface landing on Artemis IV. None of them has any incentive to say something on a press tour that would mark them as unreliable. The people who fly the next missions are the people who handled the first one cleanly. Cleanly means saying what the data supports and not speculating about what it does not. It means leaving the strange parts in the analysis pipeline and waiting for someone else to release them. Or not. There is something else. During the flyby, the crew worked from a list of specific observation targets prepared by planetary scientist David Kring, who had spent years training them on what to look for. One target on that list was Reiner Gamma, a bright swirling pattern on the near side of the moon roughly 60 kilometers across, sitting on top of a localized magnetic anomaly that produces a miniature magnetosphere. Reiner Gamma has been observed for 4 centuries. Nobody knows what it is. It casts no shadow, has no topography, and its swirl pattern does not align with any known geological structure. The leading theories involve solar-wind interaction, comet impacts, or a buried elliptical disk of magnetized material from an oblique impact that grazed the lunar surface at a shallow angle. None of them are confirmed. The Artemis II crew photographed Reiner Gamma. Their observations are being compared against orbital data. What they actually saw at that high human resolution with their trained eyes and calibrated cameras is one of the data sets that has not been released in full. Then there are the impact flashes. 6 confirmed during the eclipse, each lasting less than a millisecond. bright points of bluish-white light appearing on the dark lunar surface as small rocks slammed into the regolith at tens of kilometers per second. The crew was trained to expect maybe 1 or 2 flashes. They saw 6. The reaction in Houston, according to lunar science lead Kelsey Young, was audible screams of delight. That is the public version. What is not public is whether the crew saw anything else during that observation window, because the cameras were running, the eyes were watching. The eclipse lasted nearly 54 minutes, and 6 flashes is an extraordinary count, but it is also a count that ends. There is no public statement on whether the crew observed any other points of light during that period. There is no statement on whether any of the photographs from the eclipse window contain features that did not match the expected impact flash signature. There is silence in the space where that statement would be. This is how the pattern repeats. Apollo astronauts came home with experiences they could not fully describe. Some had clean technical explanations, which arrived years later. Some are still on semi-classified analysis tapes that get released piecemeal as institutions age. The Artemis II crew is at the start of that process. The mission ended on April 10th. The full analysis will take months. The full release will take years. And somewhere between what the 4 astronauts saw with their own eyes during 40 minutes of radio blackout behind the moon and what eventually appears in the public record, there is a gap. That gap is what the rest of this decade will fill in, maybe with science, maybe with something quieter. There is a final detail worth sitting with. When Reed Wiseman was asked at a post-mission press conference what he most wanted the public to understand about the flight, he did not talk about the eclipse. He did not talk about the photographs. He did not talk about the record-breaking distance. He talked about how small Earth looked from 252,000 miles away, a blue crescent dropping behind a gray horizon. He said the experience changed him. He did not say in what way. He did not elaborate. He moved on to the next question. And in the careful management of what he said and did not say, you could see the entire 60-year history of astronaut public communication compressed into a single sentence. They go, they see, they come back, and they tell us what they are allowed to tell us, which is most of it, but never all of it. Whatever the 4 astronauts of integrity saw in their 7-hour window over the lunar far side, whatever they heard in their headsets during the radio blackout, whatever pattern appeared in their photographs that did not match the briefing materials, is now sitting on a server at Johnson Space Center. Engineers are processing it. Scientists are analyzing it. Public affairs officers are deciding what gets released and when. The crew, meanwhile, is in post-flight reconditioning, watching their bone density rebuild, their cardiovascular systems readjust, their eyes recalibrate to a world where down is a fixed direction again. They will fly again. Some of them will walk on the moon. And the things they saw on this first flight, the ones they have not yet described in public, will either appear in a peer-reviewed paper 3 years from now, or they will appear in a memoir 30 years from now, or they will not appear at all. We are at the beginning of a new era of human spaceflight, and the first lesson that era is teaching us, the one Apollo already taught us and we forgot, is that the moon does not give up its secrets immediately. It hands them over slowly to the people who go there. And those people decide, one careful sentence at a time, what the rest of us get to know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.